I'd like to start by acknowledging that we are here today on the traditional territory of the Sunema First Nation, and as guests to this land, we are grateful for the opportunity to live, learn, work, and play here. And I'd also encourage you to seek out opportunities to further the process of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples whenever you can. Today's colloquium is also part of VIU's 2021 celebration of Global Citizens Week. Each year, VIU marks this week with activities, visiting speakers, and classroom dialogues that explore issues of global development and social justice at home and abroad. This year's theme is Equity in Action. Together, we've been exploring ways that we can challenge inequity from systemic racism and unconscious bias to inequity in health, human rights, climate, and more at home and abroad. We hope you find today's colloquium engaging and informative, and that your experiences this week will encourage you to dig deeper, to think about your place in the world, and ultimately to help you grow as an active citizen of the world. Next, as we are still in Zoom mode for the colloquium, here's the standard reminder about proper Zoom etiquette. Please make sure that your Zoom screen is on mute. A slash should be running through the microphone icon at the bottom left of your screen. Otherwise, everyone will hear whatever is going on in your location. So we thank you for muting. And those of us on the Arts and Humanities Colloquium Planning Committee would also like to express our continuing gratitude to the Office of the Dean of Arts and Humanities, led by the Dean herself, Dr. Marnie Stanley, for the ongoing financial and moral support that allows this series to continue even in this alternative Zoom format. Now, of course, as many of you know, it's become standard tradition to add a bit of a musical tribute to the Dean. I must say that this time around, I struggled a little more than normal to come up with an appropriate song. But I was finally inspired by the fact that today's session is very dominated by members of the history department. Our presenter, Dr. Kelly Black, teaches in the department. The introducer, who you'll see shortly, Dr. Catherine Rollwagon, is also a member of the department, as am I, as is Dr. Catherine Spence, who is the chair of the Arts and Humanities Colloquium Planning Committee. So history. So I thought, well, okay, there should be a song with some sort of history connection. And then I keep reading about how sea shanties are all the rage suddenly online. So I thought, okay, well, there is perhaps extra inspiration. And so I came up in the end with my version of the Stan Rogers classic, Barrett's Privateers, and something I call Colloquium Pioneers, because a little history lesson of the colloquium here as well. So here goes. Oh, the year, you see, was 2009. That's the date we started the colloquium. When Katarina Rout and Helen Brown thought humanities work should be known in town, God bless them now. They were bold, they gave us a vision that was better than gold. We'd all talk clear with no fear. Now we hold these talks 6 times a year, all thanks to Colloquium Pioneers. Well, here we are in 2021, still holding these colloquiums. And we thank Marnie for all she gives to help ensure the colloquium lives. God bless her now. She stands bold and holds to the vision that was better than gold. So we all talk clear with no fear. And we still hold these talks 6 times a year, all thanks to Colloquium Pioneers. Yes, we still hold these talks 6 times a year, and we hope you find, hope they bring you knowledge and cheer. Thank you. We might have to do that again when we have a full house and get everyone rocking. Anyway, now please give a rousing sea shanty welcome to Dr. Catherine Rollwagon, as she will be introducing Dr. Kelly Black, who will be enlightening us on aspects of his work and his other job as the executive director of Point Ellice Historic Site. Catherine, over to you.
Thank you, Tim. Good morning, everyone. It gives me great pleasure to introduce my colleague and friend, Dr. Kelly Black, to you today. Kelly is an adjunct professor in the Department of History here at VIU, where he's been teaching since 2015. And this semester, he is teaching 20th century BC history. Kelly is also the executive director of Point Ellice House Museum and Gardens in Victoria. He completed his PhD in Canadian Studies and Political Economy at Carleton University. He writes and speaks on a variety of subjects, including heritage conservation, museums, settler colonialism, local history, the ENN land grant, and public history. And in his spare time, he is also the president of the Friends of the BC Archives. Kelly is a researcher, a writer, a historian, a collector of books, a reader of every historical plaque, a lover of nature, and a resident with his wife and 2 cats of Shawnigan Lake. I first worked closely with Kelly to plan the BC Studies Conference at VIU in 2017, Unsettling BC History, during which I witnessed his strong commitment to equity and social justice. Kelly's work to decolonize the past and to make it more accessible is an important step towards reconciliation on Vancouver Island, and I'm really looking forward to hearing more about that work at Point Ellice House this morning. So without further ado, I'll pass the virtual mic to Dr. Kelly Black.
Thanks, Catherine. And I now have my own version of a Stan Rogers song that that was beautiful though. Thank you, Tim. And thank you to Catherine for that great introduction. I want to begin today by sharing my screen. There we go. Hopefully that's working for everybody. I want to begin by acknowledging the territory of the Swinnemic First Nation. As I hope to show in today's presentation, public history is essential to truth and reconciliation, and it is through my work as an educator and a museum worker that I try to move beyond acknowledgement toward generational change and the restitution of land. Thank you to Catherine Spence and the Colloquium organizers for putting this together. Thank you also to Rob, Eliza, and the Malaspina Theatre students for helping us with today's setup. It's really lovely to be here in a theater, although there's only about 5 people here. It's nice to get out of the living room for a change. First of all, I want to start with an explanation of the title of my talk. The Room Where It Happened references the song from the musical Hamilton, and the recent book by Trump's former national security advisor and all-around evil guy with a mustache, John Bolton. In both cases, the room is where the decisions are made. And in Bolton's book, this is the Oval Office of the White House. This isn't a talk about the White House, you'll be glad to know. The title is really just to catch your attention. And I won't be singing from the Hamilton songbook. I think Tim set us off on a good point there. But I am talking about a historic house, a family home full of rooms where things happened. Some of these things were mundane or everyday, and some of them had lasting consequences for Victoria, British Columbia, and Canada as we know it today. Those rooms, that home, is Point Ellice House, or PEH for short. Point Ellice House was built between 1861 and 1862 for Kate and Charles Wallace. Kate was the 6th of 8 daughters born to John Work, a Hudson's Bay Company trader and chief factor, and Josette or Suzette Lagacé, his Métis wife. Charles was involved in a number of fledgling businesses in the colony of Vancouver Island, and unfortunately went bankrupt, forcing him to sell the home to Peter O'Reilly. In this picture here, we have an image of Kate and Charles Wallace from the BC Archives. This is a picture of Point Ellice House in 1863 on the left of your screen. The Tirrett Drake home is on the right there, now demolished. The O'Reilly family moved into the house in December 1867. Peter came to the colony of Vancouver Island in 1859, and in 1863 he married Caroline Trutch. He served as magistrate, judge, sheriff, gold commissioner, and also worked as Indian Reserve Commissioner, retiring in 1898. A little bit more on that later. The O'Reilly family lived in the house for 108 years, 3 generations, including Frank, Kathleen, Mary, and Arthur. Kathleen and Arthur were born at the house and they died at the house. The O'Reilly family sold the house to the province of British Columbia in 1975. Today, the house at 2616 Pleasant Street is a National Historic Site and a Provincial Heritage Site. My employer, the Vancouver Island Local History Society, operates the site on behalf of the province of BC. This picture here shows Point Ellice House in 1954. And you can see that industry has moved in all around Point Ellice House by this time. Note the log booms in the Selkirk Water or Gorge Waterway and the railway tracks, today called the rail yards, a condo development. But you can see here, Point Ellice House is the only place with trees really in this image. Point Ellice House boasts a collection of more than 12,000 objects, 2 acres of heritage gardens, and the longest remaining natural shoreline on Victoria's Gorge Waterway, as you can see in this image. Today, surrounded by light industry, Point Ellice House does not have the profile of some of Victoria's other heritage attractions. It remains a relatively unknown gem within the city, although that's something that we're working on, as I hope to demonstrate. In my blurb for this talk, I posed 2 questions. How can a museum focused on the celebration of colonial power and privilege challenge its most enduring associations? And what can we learn by promoting or prioritizing stories and projects that are unsettling or discordant? To answer these questions, or at least to respond to them, I want to begin with my first question about enduring associations, and then discuss how myself, staff, and volunteers are introducing a radical shift to how public history has been practiced at the site. So, what is public history? We might think of it as the applied aspect of history. I'm pretty confident that folks watching this have encountered or even participated in public history, even if it wasn't labeled as such. Of course, it's more than plaques, which I do love to read, but public history includes the work of museums, archives, heritage planning, various forms of commemoration, historical fiction, film, media, theater, and more. At VIU, the Canadian Letters and Images Project is probably our best known public history project. Dr. Catherine Rollwagon, who gave me that lovely introduction, described her public history course at VIU to me in this way. She said, it's an opportunity for students to explore public history as, in part, the study of collective historical consciousness. How narratives about the past and the institutions that propagate these narratives are decided. Who gets to decide what we know about the past? Who is remembered and why? This is also the approach I take when teaching Canadian and BC history here at VIU and in my work at Point Ellice House. In the book, Writing British Columbia by Chad Reimer, he identifies 3 broad areas of historical writing about British Columbia: promotional history, pioneer history, and professional history. We can also use these categories to understand public history interpretation in British Columbia and at Point Ellice House. Briefly, I'll introduce these to give some context to the production of historical narrative in British Columbia. The first being promotional history. Promotional histories of the 19th and early 20th century were written to attract settlement and investment, and were intended to demonstrate the potential for places such as British Columbia to play a role in the, quote, progress and expansion of empire. To this category, I would also add public histories which promote British Columbia as a place unburdened by a legacy of colonization. The second category is pioneer history. Pioneer histories take it to be self-evident, to be obvious that British Columbia has achieved some great place within the Pacific Northwest, Canada, or the Empire and the world. And these pioneer histories celebrate the newly arrived settlers who helped the province achieve this progress. Pioneer history flourished particularly from the 1920s to the 1970s, the period when dominant narratives of Peter O'Reilly and Point Ellice House emerge. Professional history refers to the work of BC's history institutions, archives, museums, and universities like VIU. And this period really begins with the creation of a provincial museum for British Columbia in 1886. In the case of Point Ellice House, professional managers took over in the mid-1970s, conducting research and formulating narratives based on that work. Building from these categories, and for our purposes today, I want to focus on three key narratives that have characterized how generations of visitors have come to know, or perhaps not know, Point Ellice House and its occupants. The first is Peter O'Reilly as an eminent pioneer. The second is the glory of Victoriana. And the third is something that we call the period of interpretation, which I'll explain a little later on. Before I move on to the next slide, I just want to point out the book that I have on the screen here. This is what we would call a promotional history, written in 1865 by Matthew McPhee. It's called Vancouver Island and British Columbia, Their History, Resources, and Prospects. It's a bit of a reconnaissance for settlement and investment. If we take the death of Peter O'Reilly in 1905 as a starting point for tracing this first narrative, we see some key themes at play. The Colonist newspaper wrote at the time, "The death occurred last evening at the family residence, Pleasant Street, of one of the eminent pioneer residents of the city, and one whose life work was closely wrapped up with all that tended to the development of the province since the early days." So, as early as 1905, we have O'Reilly positioned as an eminent pioneer. There's nothing particularly incorrect about this description, but as I want to show today, it's the enduring nature of this take, and this take only, that is of particular concern when we consider public history at Point Ellice House. In a report on O'Reilly's funeral 2 days later, the colonist explained that O'Reilly's work took him on many travels, and that, quote, he knew the province so well. Indeed, I would argue that O'Reilly traveled across BC more than any other settler at the time, or perhaps since. When BC joined Confederation with Canada in 1871, the two governments could not agree on how to create reserves in a province where very few treaties were signed. After disagreement over the reserve creation process through the 1870s, O'Reilly, the brother-in-law of the former Lieutenant Governor Joseph Trutch, was selected as Indian Reserve Commissioner to put an end to the Indian land question and make way for settlement. Between 1881 and 1898, he set out, reduced, eliminated, or in a few cases expanded over 600 reserves in British Columbia. So how do I know that the narrative of O'Reilly as an eminent pioneer, rather than an agent of colonization, has endured? I like to show this 1969 stop of interest sign as one example. And while you read this, I'm just going to pause for a sip of water. So you can see my question here, what's missing? Well, essentially, every job Peter O'Reilly ever had is on this plaque, except for that one that he spent 18 years doing, his time as Indian Reserve Commissioner. If we consider the context of First Nations political resistance in the 1960s, when this plaque was put up in BC and in Canada, we might understand this omission as more than simply a question of word count or oversight. Like most efforts at public history, the plaque played and plays a role in shaping the past and the present. The year this plaque was erected, 1969, the Union of BC Indian Chiefs was founded, and the federal government's white paper proposed to end the special legal relationship between Indigenous peoples and the Canadian state. A few years prior to this plaque, the province argued in the landmark Bob and White case on the Nanaimo Treaty of 1854 that the document was not a treaty and that it did not matter because all First Nations had been assimilated into Canadian culture. Again, that's the province of British Columbia making that argument. So, how many people have stopped, read this sign, and come away with nothing more than an understanding that Peter O'Reilly was an eminent pioneer? Of course, with the death of Peter in 1905, the story of Point Ellice House does not end. The O'Reilly family continued to live at 2616 Pleasant Street for another 70 years, even while the stop of interest sign was put up in front of their house. But let's step back from 1969 for a moment and consider the 1858 and 1967 centennial celebrations in the province. These are integral events for our understanding of public history in British Columbia. At Point Ellice House, 1958 was simply another year as a family home. But I want to mention it because it marks the beginning of the province's efforts to acquire heritage properties. To celebrate British Columbia's centennial, 1858 to 1958, the province acquired and restored the 1860s gold rush town of Barkerville near Prince George. The purchase of Barkerville and other historic properties in the region supported the narrative of frontier, Wild West history and the pursuit of, quote, progress. Premier W.A.C. Bennett's introduction to the 1958 official centennial record captures this, and I want to read it for you. He wrote, or maybe someone wrote on behalf of him, "These pages are designed to illustrate what British Columbia was and is. They will tell stories of romance and adventure, of exploration and settlement, of the search for riches in furs, in gold, in fisheries, farming and forestry, of courage, achievement, and daring. They will tell the story of development, of the building of a character and a homogeneous province, of a God-fearing, pioneering people dedicated to progress, strengthened by their contest with a great land, at first reluctant to yield its full resources." Historian Ben Bradley explains that the acquisition and restoration of Barkerville by the province proved to be an asset that could further the government's economic objectives. Increased economic activity for the region followed the restoration, but the project also lent justification to other projects such as road building, which would support the forest industry in the area. In other words, public history, if managed like a resource, could embody and support a narrative of progress, a story about where BC started and where it was headed. Similarly, the first modern and comprehensive history of the province was also issued as part of this 1958 centennial. It was commissioned by the province and it was written by historian Margaret Ormsby, a seminal book, a professional history. But in this nearly 600-page book, there is not one reference to the Indian Reserve Commission. If it was romance and adventure that the Premier was looking for, then he would have encountered it at Point Ellice House in the late 1960s. After John O'Reilly and Inez Whiffen got together in the 1960s, Inez began work on fixing up the house and advocating for its historical significance. Without Inez, it is very likely that Point Ellice House would have been sold and demolished, just like its neighbors. As part of their advocacy, Point Ellice House was designated a National Historic Site in 1966. And in 1967, Canada's centennial year, Point Ellice House received funding for restoration and opened as a private museum at the end of 1967. Picture on this screen here dates from the 1950s and the inside of the house, but you begin to get a sense here of the family living in the house with all of these Victorian objects surrounding them. Now, the results of this restoration project are explained in what I would describe as a sexist and condescending report from the restoration architect Peter Stokes to the National Historic Sites branch. And an interesting side note is that the National Historic Sites branch of the federal government was located in the Department of Indian Affairs. He wrote, The O'Reilly House still has to be seen to be believed. How its glories are flaunted in a rather vulgar way by Inez, in the writer's view, but this is due to an over-exuberant and overabundant enthusiasm for such unusually unseen wonders. An incongruous pleasure in a family fortune of Victorian furnishings, trinkets, and trumpery. The splendor is revealed and the illusion shattered by overemphasis. Like a moon seen in a million mirrors, there needs to be direction, a program, a schedule, a plan to ensure that this glory of Victoriana is not lost to Victoria and Canada forever. In Stokes' report, we see a push to make sense of the home and its collection, to manage, like Barkerville, to order it and develop narratives and themes that celebrate this glory of Victoriana without the ad hoc approach of people that were still living inside the house. In the case of the 1967 centennial, historian Claire Campbell notes that the restoration projects such as this were intended to solidify national history and promote attractions that were, quote, symbolic statements of a distinctively Canadian, not American, story. With Inez and John telling the story of their home, there was no outside control over the interpretation. It would appear that Inez's approach to tours of the museum, while she and John still lived in it, was come and look at all this interesting stuff. Perhaps to John and Inez, the fact that the house remained and contained so many objects from the past was proof enough of its glory. To them, the occupants of the house, it was not in need of ordering. On the slide here, you see a picture of Inez in the left. We haven't been able to identify the woman on the right yet, but you can see that they're both dressed in a form of period costume. Pictures from this grand opening in 1967 reveal something of how visitors encountered public history at Point Ellice House. In this image, on the left, we see Inez in period costume. In fact, it's a dress of Caroline O'Reilly's that she altered, as well as Lieutenant Governor Major Perks cutting the ribbon, and James Nesbitt in the back on the left. John O'Reilly is in the center of the picture. Today, we see the objects at Point Ellice House as part of a museum collection, but for Inez, they were simply part of the family tickle trunk. You also get a sense in the picture on the right of the invited guests. They were obviously encouraged to also dress up in period costume and celebrate this glory of Victoriana. This picture is taken in the dining room at Point Ellice House with everyone dressed in their finest. And it looks like real candles being lit on the table, which is a big no-no today in the museum. James Nesbitt, who I mentioned is just kind of out of frame in that picture, was a newspaper columnist and a big promoter of the house and its contents. As early as 1948, he was writing about the house, the beginnings of his Old Homes and Families series that ran in the Daily Colonist paper. He wrote in 1948 about the gilt and moldings in the house, specifically in the drawing room. And he notes, quote, "It has changed little from the days when young naval officers met pretty young ladies at tea and danced on the porch and had tennis parties in the garden." Now, Nesbitt wrote many articles about Point Ellice House and the O'Reillys, especially about Kathleen O'Reilly, who had a number of courtships with Royal Navy officers, including Captain Robert Scott of Antarctic fame. These did not end up going anywhere. Kathleen never married, but she was a source of fascination for Nesbitt, and as we'll see, for the site's public history as a whole. These articles all had a healthy dose of this romance and adventure at a time when old homes were being demolished and the old families were losing prominence. Nesbitt ordered and linked Point Ellice House to the romance and glory of Victoria's golden age. Nesbitt's articles fed curiosity among the public, while Inez's tours in her altered dress brought these narratives to life. Indeed, Nesbitt's articles remained at the core of volunteer training manuals from the 1990s through to 2018. This picture on the slide here is kind of this narrative embodied. Here we have a tennis party circa, I think, 1884. Peter and Caroline are seated in the back on the bench. Kathleen is in the white dress with the tennis racket. I believe Frank, her brother, is also in this image, and the other men are Royal Navy officers. So I hope we are thus far getting an idea for how certain narratives or stories about Point Ellice House, about British Columbia, about Canada, become compounded and entrenched through the practice of public history. It's not that stories about the O'Reilly's place in the Victoria community are wrong, it's that their promotion obscured other stories, particularly those that explain the work of empire and colonization. For narratives such as these to take hold, they have to be worked at over time. Now, despite John and Inez's best efforts at making Point Ellice House a private museum, it wasn't a financial success. And the couple, they were deeply involved in the Social Credit Party. So it's perhaps no surprise then that the provincial social credit government was convinced to buy Point Ellice House and its collection in 1974. And so in 1975, Point Ellice House shifts from a family home to a house museum. And this marks the beginning of new knowledge creation about Point Ellice House as professional managers begin to undertake archaeological and archival studies to better understand the site and its history. For government heritage officials, acquiring knowledge about the house would help to develop the key concept that house museums across North America have used to order and interpret their sites: the period of interpretation. The POI, or period of interpretation, is intended to capture a set of moments in time at a house. For example, the POI selected for Point Ellice House was 1890 to 1914. It's no coincidence that this period marks the height of the O'Reillys' social standing and modest wealth. Of course, a POI also means that parts of the story and possible public history narratives are also removed. Point Ellice House was first built for a Métis woman and her family and was lived in until 1975. A POI of 1890 to 1914 is less than 1/4 of the home's history. The rooms where some things happened during a particular time frame. And it's no surprise that this is also the period when the British Empire was at its height, or to put it another way, it reflects a period when the British Empire had dispossessed the most people from their territory. In this slide, there's an article from the Victoria Times, and you can't read it, but I'll just note that it doesn't mention the Indian Reserve Commission, and it doesn't mention the Wallace family. It does, however, mention the things that are mentioned in that 1969 plaque. To reflect and reinforce the connection with the glory of empire, or the glory of Victoriana, the government heritage branch added afternoon tea service to the site programming in the 1980s. This tea service became central to the visitor experience and served to reinforce, whether intended or not, the key narratives first promoted by Nesbitt and Inez: ladies, romance, roses, civility, and etiquette. This, on the right-hand side, you see a rack card from Point Ellice House from the early 1990s. And you'll note that it says, "Where everything stops for tea." We have mention of Sir John A. Macdonald, who visited the house in 1886. More on that later. We have mention of Scott of the Arctic, entertained by a young Kathleen O'Reilly. And of course, it says that you can experience tea on the lawn with the same care and attention enjoyed at the height of Queen Victoria's empire, the glory of Victoriana. By the mid-1990s, provincial employees at the site were experimenting with digital history. And these efforts culminated in a website and an audio tour of the site. A Chinese house servant and other hired laborers were deployed as narrators. But the narrative didn't really change. Indeed, as Dr. Maceo Dean, our current president of our society, wrote in 2002, quote, "The Chinese Canadian houseboy, the Cockney maid, and the Irish gardener may be British Columbians, but they exist only at the margins of white settler culture, mere witnesses to what men like O'Reilly did. The taped tour fails to address the diversity of British Columbia because it treats Point Ellice House as a domestic microcosm that existed independently of the imperial project that sustained it, rather than attempting to show how the two were mutually interdependent. Prosperity in the heart of empire depends upon exploitation at its margins." This perceptive critique by Maceo was not embraced by site managers. In fact, the audio tour moved from CDs to iPod shuffles and was in use until the mid-2010s. The work of Peter O'Reilly as Indian Reserve Commissioner was also omitted from this tour. Even academics had largely ignored O'Reilly's work in this regard, for example, Margaret Ormsby's British Columbia History. On the slide here, I have a screenshot of the website that was first put up in the mid-1990s. You can use the Wayback Machine through archive.org to find this website. And it's very interesting to read it because while on one hand, the period of interpretation is used to exclude other things, the tour bounces around all timeframes, but it doesn't mention the Indian Reserve Commission, and it sticks to those tried and true narratives, which you can probably see on the screen here. We have Captain Robert Scott mentioned, of course, or Sir Henry Stanhope, later Lord Chesterfield, etc., etc. It wasn't until 1997 when Kenneth Brayley published his article, Travels from Point Ellice House, Peter O'Reilly and the Indian Reserve System in British Columbia, that O'Reilly's 18 years creating Indian reserves was given serious attention. Although Brayley's article is not focused on public history per se, he was among the first to note that Indian reserves in BC are very much the story of Point Ellice House and of the geography of settler colonialism in British Columbia. This is what Brayley wrote. "My purpose is to show that the commission was as much, if not more, O'Reilly than anyone or anything else, and in doing so, to make visible the stratum of provincial space that he constructs. I also want to show that O'Reilly's space, the compartmentalized space of the reserve system, is very much our space, and that to understand the dynamic space of the Indian Reserve Commissioner is to understand the historical genesis and possible future evolution of our own." Now, I want to mention Kenneth Brayley. He passed away a couple of years ago, and I never had the chance to talk to him about this article. I really wish we had the opportunity to bring him to Point Ellice House and to show him what we're doing. Unfortunately, we didn't get that opportunity, but it's a very important article. But here also, we can see the gap between professional or scholarly history and public history, because like with Maceo Dean's work or Kenneth Brayley's insights, they did not find their way into the interpretation at Point Ellice House. To this point, I hope I've been able to show that over time, public history has been used to paint a very particular picture of Point Ellice House. This work also extends beyond the site and reveals the kinds of stories that white settler British Columbians have produced and promoted about the past. This slide, before I move on, is comes from the minutes of decision. Peter O'Reilly, when he was in the field, he often had a surveyor and other people to help him, and he would write down his minutes of decision, where he decided or others decided the reserves would go, how big they would be, etc. And then he would come back to Victoria, to Point Ellice House, and he would compile that information, send it to the province, and send it to the federal government. And these minutes of decision have been digitized by the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, so you can read them at length. In 2004, the BC Liberal government devolved the operation of provincial heritage sites away from government to businesses and nonprofits. Heritage sites were seen as a burden on the Treasury, but still popular enough that outright sale of the sites would probably have caused an uproar. In 2004, the Capital Mental Health Association took over Point Ellice House with an agreement to manage the site and provide opportunities for people struggling with mental health. These opportunities included tasks like mowing the lawn. Advancing public history beyond the already established narratives was not part of the plan. In this excerpt from the Times Colonist from March 2004, we see a representative of the CMHA saying that the association has no expertise in heritage operations, and it will rely on volunteers to look after the 10,000 artifacts in the Point Ellice House collection. That means afternoon teas will resume, the gift shop will reopen, tours of the house are set to start again on the Victoria Day weekend. Of course, the Victoria Day weekend, the glory of Victoriana. During this period, research about Point Ellice House, and thus understanding the many stories of the place, basically slowed to a halt. In 2008, a different nonprofit society took over management, and although some staff were employed on a part-time basis to care for the grounds and collection, it is the afternoon tea service that dominated the visitor experience at Point Ellice House. So what did devolution and declining financial support do for Point Ellice House, the public profile of Point Ellice House? In the interest of time, I'll summarize it this way. Point Ellice House is associated with tea service and a house full of things no family member could bear to throw away. Come look at all these interesting things and also have tea. Limited resources resulted in further reliance on already established narratives and the afternoon tea service. How then do these associations serve our understanding of Point Ellice House's past and BC's past? Let me return to the questions I posed at the beginning. How can a museum founded on the celebration of colonial power and privilege challenge its most enduring associations? This was the challenge before me when our nonprofit, the Vancouver Island Local History Society, took over management of PEH in 2019. First and foremost, our goal was to return Point Ellice House into a professional museum, rather than a tea house with a collection of objects on the side. You can see part of our mission here up on the screen, that we believe that Point Ellice House is a site that reflects the history of BC and can serve as Victoria's museum, a site to encounter stories about the communities around us. Here I also want to engage with my second question. What can we learn by prioritizing stories and projects that are unsettling or discordant? Using a few examples from the last 2 years, I hope to demonstrate that public history focused on community, critical engagement, truth, and reconciliation, rather than the period of interpretation, tourism, the glory of Victoriana, and progress, has a great deal to offer our understanding of the present. Now, I use the word discordant, maybe not a word we hear a lot. So I put the definition up there, one of the definitions being at variance, disagreeing, incongruous. But I really like this geological definition of discordant, which is structurally unconformable. And I like this because I think some of what we're doing at Point Ellice House, like talking about the Indian Reserve Commission, doesn't conform to the structure that had been set out for the site prior to our taking over of management. For example, the first thing we did was eliminate afternoon tea service. To counter the entrenched narratives and associations, this was our first action, but it was a controversial one. If visitors to Victoria want tea, there are many options to choose from. There is, however, no museum for the city of Victoria, and that's a gap we hope to fill, at least in part. You can see on the screen here, not having afternoon tea service was unconformable, but it also made people uncomfortable. This is something I still get phone calls. In fact, last week I had a phone call asking when we would be open again for afternoon tea service. And even though it says on our website we don't serve tea, this is how this has endured and become really associated and entrenched with the site. One of the second things we did was to reimagine the visitor experience at PEH. We created a feature exhibit space in the visitor center, previously where afternoon tea would be held, and we overhauled the presentation inside the historic house. If you visited PEH between the 1980s and 2018, you'll know that the inside of the house rarely changed. The displays, like the narratives, were static. If you visited once, there was really little reason to visit again. Changing exhibits allow opportunities for visitors to return for a new experience. Our first exhibit was titled The Politics of Luxury, and it introduced visitors to the house and its history. Yes, there are still the narratives of Kathleen suitors and social gatherings, but they are put in the context of new interpretive themes, including the families of Point Ellice House, settler colonialism, Victoria's social life, shaping the city, the help, class, and labor, not just unnamed narrators giving an audio tour, but we actually have interpretive panels that name the people, some of the people who worked at the house, because we know through the archival record what their names were. Gender history, the house and its architecture, technology of the day. We have over 12,000 objects, some of which you may recognize, some of which you may not, because things have changed. Victorian childhood. Remember, 3 generations of people lived at Point Ellice House, so a lot of people grew up at the house. And the history of heritage at Point Ellice House, something I'll come back to in a moment. These pictures on the screen here show you a poster of for our exhibit. Note the image that I showed earlier, but also a couple of pictures of what the new visitor center looks like on the left, or the new interior of the visitor center, and what the refreshed exhibits inside the house look like. This is a picture of the drawing room on the bottom right-hand side. Note the interpretive panel that the woman is reading there. Research, research, research. In his 2003 Massey lecture, The Truth About Stories, Thomas King notes that the truth about stories is, that's all we are. Our closure during the pandemic has given us time to delve into historical research, focusing on parts of the Point Ellice House story that were previously ignored in favor of the old narratives. If we don't have stories, how can we engage visitors? And research is integral to knowing what those stories are. I like to use Mary Wyndham O'Reilly as an example. This was John O'Reilly's mother and Arthur's wife. And she lived at the house from the First World War, when Arthur and Mary got married, to 1963. And the collection is actually filled with a number of objects from her life and her aristocratic family, the Wyndhams, who, by the way, are intimately linked with the history of empire. Her story was basically ignored by past researchers, something we are working to correct. At the BC Archives, where much of the O'Reilly family record is retained, there is 7.78 meters of textual records. So imagine almost 8 meters of papers stacked up. That's how much there is to learn about this family, just this family, not even the others, which we're also trying to talk about, like the Wallace family. We're interested in John and Inez's time in the house, as I've mentioned, Mary, or Frank O'Reilly and his family, who we know not that much about. Their life in England. The O'Reilly children went to school in England. There's a lot to know about there. They visited their family in England many times. What was going on over there? Something we need to learn more about. This reflects also their social and family networks, as well as the other land holdings that the O'Reilly family and Wallace's had, and the other business ventures that both families were involved in. Similarly, the fruits of our research and our digitization projects are not a secret. We're making them accessible to the public. You can visit our historical resources site on our website and see literally hundreds of pages of correspondence that we have transcribed and digitized thanks to the work of staff and volunteers. You can also search the collection through the Provincial Heritage Artifact Database. We have a YouTube channel where we delve into some of these stories that we're trying to tell. Access is key to generating engagement and hopefully additional scholarly work. Open access, unpaid, free access. We're also introducing, from the fruits of this research, new narratives. I've mentioned the Wallace family. Excuse me. They only lived there for a few years, but they are part of the story. And the past erasure of Kate and her Métis heritage in favor of the period of interpretation is something that we have rectified through the new interpretation. I mentioned Point Ellice House and its place in a changing city. Our second feature exhibit, Springs and Scavengers, Waste and Water in Victoria, addresses daily life in the house, getting water, going to the bathroom, getting rid of waste, with changes in the city. And visitors peek into the water closets of the house, and they learn how both families that lived there were involved in the privatization of the city's water supply. Additionally, visitors also discover how in early Victoria, marginalized communities, Chinese, Indigenous, and Black, were involved in waste and water matters, and how they were both denied basic amenities and criticized for the lack of them. Point Ellice House doesn't stand alone. Although it might be orphaned in terms of its surroundings, and this is some drone footage that you can see of what it looks like around Point Ellice House, it's still connected to the changing city. We chose waste and water because we are surrounded by waste and water sites. And it's a story that people can recognize. I think we all have to drink water and go to the bathroom. I mentioned the history of heritage. The John and Inez period through the 60s and the early 70s saw several changes made to the house so that they could live in it comfortably while also providing a visitor experience. I like to look to the 1960s kitchen as an example of this history of heritage. It was formerly a dressing room off of Caroline's room, but then it was converted to a small galley kitchen. Today, we use it for a curatorial office because space is at a premium with 12,000 objects. But eventually, I would like to restore it to be a 1960s kitchen. Of course, this goes against the period of interpretation, but then that's the point. It's part of the story. Speaking of people being, narratives being unconformable and people being made uncomfortable, talking about settler colonialism has certainly made some people uncomfortable, but it has also opened up new narratives. And talking about Peter O'Reilly's work as Indian Reserve Commissioner is only the start. There's a lot more to do here. And one project I'd like to get financial support for, if there's any funders that are listening, is a permanent exhibit about the Indian Reserve Commission. Other events we could elaborate on here include the visit of Sir John A. Macdonald to Point Ellice House in 1886. There's no question that the Prime Minister and Peter gathered in the study to discuss the Indian land question, the room where it happened. And this, on the interpretive panel in Peter's study, this is part of what we say. The view that Indigenous people were not making proper use of the land was prominent in Canada. Today, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls on us to reject such concepts, which were used to justify European sovereignty over Indigenous lands and peoples. Again, unconformable, and for some people, uncomfortable. Finally, on new narratives, I want to talk a little bit about disability. And speaking of Sir John A. Macdonald, it's worth noting that the Macdonalds and the O'Reillys had a relationship outside of the Indian land question. Archival records show that the Macdonald and O'Reilly parents shared personal correspondence for a number of years. Perhaps this rapport was in part because both families had daughters with a disability. Mary O'Reilly had cerebrospinal meningitis, while Mary Macdonald had hydrocephalus. They were both born in the same year, both named Mary. And included in the O'Reilly family fond at the BC Archives is an 1892 poem written by Mary Macdonald. As well, Peter was in a carriage accident in 1885, which injured his leg. He walked with a cane for the rest of his life, and these canes remain part of the Point Ellice House collection. So here's a narrative that we hope to introduce in the future at Point Ellice House. The gardens are a living exhibit at Point Ellice House, and in 2020, we began a rehabilitation of the South Garden. The goal here was to return the historic kitchen garden to its original purpose, growing food. But instead of the food going into the house, it's going back to the community. In the course of this work, we also uncovered and restored a brick pathway, and this shows that there's still a lot more to learn about the site. Our work in the gardens is public history in action. And this is a drone shot of the restored pathway. And you can read more about this on our website or in the media. When I started at Point Ellice House, I made a point of visiting and engaging with our neighbors. Point Ellice House is surrounded by light industry, but there are also coffee roasters, breweries, florists, restaurants. Most of our neighbors had never heard of or visited the site, despite being across the street or just a block or two away. Again, Point Ellice House does not stand alone. It's connected to a changing city. We have also established a relationship with the Graduate Public History program at UVic, and for 2020, students are working on a project to better understand our collection of over 600 calling cards. What they learn will then translate to our volunteer training and educational programming. Finally, I mentioned our efforts to grow food in the South Garden, and last year this food went to the Victoria Kool-Aid Society's Sandy Merriman House Shelter for Women. We've also been publishing articles in the Burnside Gorge Community Newsletter, and I have given a number of talks about Point Ellice House to local organizations. This is a snapshot of how we're practicing public history at Point Ellice House. Of course, simply updating or changing narratives does not mean that we will change all hearts and minds. Research shows that museum people are museum people, and others who don't visit are not likely to become converts. Similarly, as I think recent world events are demonstrating, and perhaps come full circle to my anecdote about the White House, some people believe what they believe. There may be little that an updated plaque or interpretive panel can do to change that. Again, I'll reference those Facebook comments that you saw in the slides. These narratives are unconformable to what came before, and they're making people uncomfortable. Still, when it comes to learning about the ongoing legacy of colonization, I'm constantly reminded by my students that there is a strong desire to learn about what was previously erased through formal and informal education. Colonization and empire were worked at by people like O'Reilly, by people like me. Narratives of progress, of the glory of Victoriana, these were worked at. So let's work at undoing them. And let's start now. It took generations to establish these narratives, and it may well take generations to undo them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kelly. That's an amazing presentation.